Hello, and there's Shuby. For anybody listening in, Oliver's got a nice dog named Shuby. Hey,
She's a
Shuby.
very nice dog.
Yeah. All right. So the title is basically the best way to start things off because it sort of encapsulates the conversation that we had yesterday while I was in Toronto with you. It basically goes religion, a how-to guide to installing humanity's software. So the conversation we had, I think, is something that's very broad, and I think that title should have hooked people listening so far. I think that's an interesting concept to look at things in a sort of computer-related way. It's just an easier way to, I guess, bundle up a lot of complex notions into one simple functional concept, right?
Right. I mean, our way of understanding reality has always, I guess, mirrored our advances in technology and science. It's like when we had the telegraph, we compared the brain to a telegraph. That's how we thought it worked. And now that we have a computer, it's the most advanced thing that we can conceive of. So it's our best form of analogizing things for the average person.
Yeah, well, you see, it's like an externalization of the human brain, of how we think. It's an extension of us, but it's also a reflection of us. You
I
know?
believe it's more complicated than that and deeper, but it's a great tool on the surface, like
Yeah.
to start to
Yeah,
start off.
it doesn't describe us or the nature of reality perfectly, but it does on a practical level, right? I mean,
Right.
if
Yeah.
you understand how computing works, or at least if you understand how the human mind works on some level, then you can sort of recreate it external to yourself, and that's what computing is, right?
Hmm.
Um, it's an understanding of ourselves to a certain degree. Of course, you're going to hit a wall at some point. I think the problem is ultimately an epistemological one. But to narrow this topic down again, I think religion is, in this context, meant to be the software for the hardware of humanity. Um, Now, I would suggest anybody who's listening to this now to read either before or after this podcast, to read Yuval Harari's Homo Deus first, and then 21 Lessons for the 21st Century second. These two books will grip you. They're fantastic, very understandable. Doesn't matter what level of information you have when it comes to technology and religion and humanity. This is a very comprehensive sort of story. Um, but I think there's a certain amount of information here that we're going to talk about tonight that does grip people. I think people will understand it on some level enough to look into it further for themselves. And I think that's really the goal here. I want people to really look at life in the way that's a little bit more necessary to look at it. So of course we have to define what is necessary. How do you look at life, or how should I look at life in a different way? And I think, if you look at the history of things, if you look at the economy of things, if you look at the religion, if you look at culture, all of these are just different lenses through which you can see patterns. And so I want to take it to the religious level. I want to understand how things work when it comes to the software of religion and how it sort of runs through the human kind of computer.
Is it necessary? And if so, is it part of us? Is it part of our evolution, how we evolved, how we came to understand things, how we biologically can conceive of things? If so, how can we use it for the best? All of those kind of questions, right?
Exactly. So the way Yuval puts it, and I think the way that many people put it, it seems to be that religion is a story that we tell ourselves, or that we create so as to be more cohesive as human beings. So the larger or the more people there are, the more cohesive the story needs to be, so that everybody's on the same page, and then they can therefore move on to the second part of reality, which is to shape it. So if you create a story, if you create a reality, right, a fictional one or non-fictional, I mean, that's always been debated since the beginning of religion and of human thought, but either way, it is a reality that is created, or at least enacted, and that's what allows you to shape the reality. So it's almost like an inductive thing. It's like a loop, right?
Mm-hmm. Say that again for everybody.
Okay, so more simply put, if you have many people on the planet Earth, right, we need to be able to talk to each other, right? Which is what language is. So before, when we were animals, we didn't have a very sophisticated way to exchange information. All you could do was, grunt or bark or hum or whatever it is you could do as an animal to exchange information. I mean, sometimes it's by scent, right? You release certain chemicals, and then it lets the people around you know what you want or what you need. Well, human beings developed a system of communication that was a lot more sophisticated, right? At the same time, our ability for self-awareness gave us the ability to transmit information that we already could sophisticatedly exchange, but it allowed us to transmit it into the future. So you could write things down. Right? That was the second part of it. We solidified the language that we were speaking, and it could be passed on to the future, and that gave us great power as well. So that system of communication, however, needed a sort of upgrade, because it's one thing to say, okay, I exist, you exist, we both feel that it's better to not fight and conquer these guys over here and fight them, so that way we can have a bigger piece of the pie, and that's enough. But when you ultimately have to deal with the logical conclusion of any of those actions taken, then you run into the existential wall, right? You're like, well, what is the purpose for us to get together and fight against these guys so that we have a bigger piece of the pie? What do we do with that pie? Ultimately speaking, you're going to need a story. You're going to need a reality that you shape so as to continue living or continue doing what you're doing. And so that story is religion, right? It's like, well, what do we do now? We've got a bigger piece of the pie, but what do we do with that piece of the pie? And does it have any meaning? And how do we extract morality from the things that we're doing? Well, that's where you need that story. You say, there you go, religion, right? Now, Yuval explains this in a very interesting way, and it comes in phases. At first, it was animism, right? We exchange information with other beings as if we were a part of a network. We were part of the ecosystem. I was an animal. This was another animal. If I ate that animal, it was, one thing. Or if I talked to another one, it was another. We just lived with everything. There was no need to create a story beyond just the actions that we were taking. Just like dogs live in the moment the way they should, and they're content in that moment. We had that to some degree, even with our intellect at first. But then we moved and we moved a little bit forward into creating that story, right, that religious sort of software, by upgrading the belief that we were part of an ecosystem in equal parts, right, to separating ourselves as being part of the ecosystem that is run by an authority. And that authority was polytheism, right? It was different gods, and those gods at first were different plants, different animals that were more powerful than us, and then eventually it became things in the stars, right? We saw patterns in the stars, and we made up gods out of them. And that polytheism was a sort of religious software that allowed us to be more cohesive to each other, right? We were able to exchange ideas and exchange stories and agree on them so that we could make progress in whatever projects that we wanted to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of the examples that he uses is the god Sobek, which was this alligator or crocodile god of the ancient Egyptians. They made a story of that god. They said that god had a desire to swim at a certain area of the Nile. Therefore, they all came together, built a dam. I'm sure many, many people died doing that. But they did it anyway. They built this dam to flood the area. Therefore, their god could go and swim in this sort of oasis part of the kingdom. And so that shaped the very reality of that people, right? They were able to spray their land with water. The agriculture was possible now that they had inundated this area. And so you can see how a story that is created a fiction directly translates to a reality that is not fictitious or fictitious. Sorry.
Well, okay. Here's a question: did these concepts really just jump out of utter bullshit? Like they were just total narratives where people tried to explain things and then they just went along with it, and it was 100% imaginary. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just asking. We have to wonder about those kinds of things because there's a lot of cases where, cultures have their holy cows, and then we think it's ridiculous, and then we find out years later that there's actually a really logical reason why they considered things that way. Like in the Ganges, people thought that the waters were healing, right? And up until recently, we thought that was crazy because, well, whatever. I mean,
yeah, there's a
it's
certain
just water. But then we discovered that the burning bodies down in I forget what the holy cities of Varanasi created lye that went down the river and actually was a disinfectant, antibacterial for the people who swam in it further down. There's all kinds of examples of kinds of things.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we can dispute the truths of these things all the way down to their logical conclusion, which is what is part of the problem. So religions allowed for cohesion, but at the same time, it allowed for disturbance, right? So there's a greater cohesion, but there's also a greater yield for discordance at the same time. So, and so, whether there's truth or no truth, these things are the actual problem when it comes to religions. And this problem so it's a good thing that you brought it up because it's a segue into monotheism. So this problem was dealt with the idea that if we didn't have discordance between religions, between beliefs and, basically between the system, the software that we use to create cohesion, because, it could be like, well, I have to fight you because you have a different God and your God is, not as powerful as mine. It won't allow for the reality that I want. And therefore we have to fight it out.
God, yeah.
No, well, see, in the beginning, polytheism, they didn't do that. The idea of a false God didn't exist. They would respect each other's gods because they knew there were many. It's like, well, if I have many gods, it makes sense that you would have many, right? So the idea of monotheism was to beat that problem. It was to cause a greater cohesion, have more political power over different peoples. Because when certain cultures would take over many other cultures, right? You would assimilate other kingdoms into your own. They all had these different belief systems. So how do you deal with that discordance between them? It's like, well, you're all one people nationalistically, politically speaking, but you're not when it comes to the software, the religion, the cohesive story that allows us to be nationalistic, right? So monotheism came about when that problem became a real issue. So that's why Constantine, the emperor of Rome, I guess at the time, said, okay, Christianity is the one true religion, is the one true God. There are no other gods. That idea became a lot more sophisticated. It allowed for more cohesion. But there's a greater discordance that comes along with that because by virtue of there only being one God and a lot of people believing that, there's a greater potential for discord towards people who believe there are many gods, because it's almost like the people sense it. If there isn't one unifying theory, then anything that contradicts that theory could potentially ruin the plans or ruin any kind of peace when it comes to a global cohesion. It seems to be a problem of numbers, right? The more people, the more there needs to be a unifying theory.
Well, a lot of this has to do with morality, right? So it's like if people are like, okay, well, there's many gods. I respect the spirits of the land. I respect the spirit of this rock, where I live, right? And he's the one who will judge me ultimately. Mm-hmm. Well, then I don't give a shit about your Christian God, so I can kill you, and I won't be judged by your Christian God. I will be judged by my own God.
Yeah.
There's the
Yeah,
morality issue too. It's not just governance.
yeah, but yeah, morality, all these things. But the point is, if you see this, if you take it from this view, if you understand a religion to be something that allows us to shape our reality and create cohesion, then you necessarily start to understand the futility in arguing the truth that it's founded on. You're looking at it more from a practical perspective. You're saying, okay, what's more practical? Do we, and especially going into the future, into the 21st century, which is why he wrote that book, what do we need to be more cohesive and not destroy ourselves, right? I mean, it's very clear that going into the future, things are going to change. The human species may actually just devolve or split off into different species. Who knows? But the point is, there are many changes, technologically speaking, environmentally speaking, and all the way down the line, that we're going to need a cohesive story. And that story it started from animism. Like I said, we were part of something. There was no story to begin with, really. We just acted out the story. Then we made it a polytheistic story, and then we used a monotheistic story. And then that monotheism became internalized, which means that God, that one God that we all believe in, we internalize it. We say, well, that one God, that one authority is the human being. It's us. Liberal values, right? I know what I want, so therefore I should be free to do what I want and what I need in order to be happy and in order to give myself purpose. The voter knows best. The customer is always right. Follow your feelings, follow your heart, all this kind of stuff. This is what Yuval says is the liberal religion, right? That cohesion story that we use, that software for our hardware. Now, going into the future, liberal values is disintegrating because we understand human beings in terms of algorithms, right? We understand that we're patterns, and these patterns can be figured out. If an algorithm or if the computer that we've created, which is an extension of ourselves, knows you better than you know yourself, then the authority no longer rests within you to make decisions, right? So whether that's true or not true, it's futile to sort of debate that if you want to be more practical. The problem is, going into the future, if God is no longer liberal values, which is basically us, then what happens to humanity? Is it going to split off? Is it going to revert to the older religions, which you're starting to see? Things are a lot more religious nowadays than they were 100 years ago. I mean, things have gotten very, very intense when it comes to religion because people are sensing that there's no cohesion. The cohesion is breaking down because things are speeding up too much, right? So this is the crux of this topic. It's trying to figure out how do we install, or first program and then install the new religion, the new software for humanity going into the 21st century. Now, I think Yuval has done a great a great deal of work to make us understand how we have already programmed this software. The software is already programmed. It's just how do we upgrade it? How do we transition it into the new hardware that's coming up? So the new hardware would be all these technological changes. We're beings that have access to all of human knowledge in our pockets, and soon it'll be directly in our brains. So human beings are intrinsically upgraded in their hardware, but we don't have a story to be cohesive. That information is all there without any purpose, right? So here's the sort of 6 steps that I've identified that Yuval really has clarified, but I just kind of made them all a lot more, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, anyway, I've taken what Yuval has described as being that programmed sort of religion thing, and I made it more analogous to a computer. Okay. So it's called Religion, a how-to guide to installing humanity's software. Okay, so number 1, determine the technology at your disposal. Number 2, implement the most efficient information processing model possible. Number 3, select a proper deity mode for your system thus far. Number 4, reevaluate and interpret all descriptive definitions for morality and other things. Number 5, strengthen Sorry, I just got loud here. I don't know if you could still hear me.
Yep.
Okay. Number 5, strengthen sacrificial ritual and implement a trapdoor out of it. And number 6, repeat some process for the economic model and ensure their compatibility, or at least potential for compatibility, i.e. Christianity and capitalism. So there's a lot of things here that people won't understand right off the bat, but these are the 6 that I think we should flush out together, and people will understand as we go along. So number 1, determine the technology at your disposal. I think we've been discussing that, and everybody's been discussing that the most. I think people understand now that the technology that is currently at our disposal, or will be very soon, is the power to re-engineer our very bodies to, encompass greater abilities. We have the technology to create entire virtual worlds and, defy the laws of physics, at least that our bodies are constrained by in the base reality. So these are the technologies that we have to take into account here, okay? And 2, implement those most...
Okay, before we just say that, we have to actually point out what technologies we're talking about.
Yeah, but, like CRISPR-Cas9, virtual reality headsets like Oculus Rift, but they're going to get a lot more sophisticated soon. Whereas you won't be able to just see and feel things. You're going to actually smell and taste, and, it's going to be pretty crazy. But I don't want to get bogged down in that because that's a long discussion. I just want to clarify these points real quick, and then I can ask you some important questions.
Right.
So the second part, after determining what technology we're dealing with, we have to implement the most efficient information processing model possible. So this is where Yuval describes politics, which is basically that if he takes communism as a good example. Communism seeked to process information centrally. If all the information was centralized, then they could have greater control and they could give the people what they wanted better. The problem is that they didn't have the processing power to do this. So a great example would be, say, this province of Russia needs this amount of bread, this amount of rice, and so on. And that information goes to Moscow. In Moscow, the people who make the decisions, well, they're going to decide where are we growing that bread and that rice, and how can we distribute it to the places and to the people that actually need those amounts. Well, that's an incredible amount of information, especially when you realize it's not just where are we making bread and where do people need it. You're talking about every political and economic decision for people's needs and their wants being processed by a very small amount of people. It's just way too slow. But with computing nowadays, so basically what won out over that was liberalism, right? Because it afforded a distributed information processing. Because there, let's say 100 people didn't have the processing power to make all these decisions. What democracy did was we make everybody make their own decisions. If people say, okay, I know how much bread I want, therefore I should be free to make the bread that I want, or at least I should be free to make the bread for the community, and the community will decide, So do you understand what I'm saying? It was distributed information processing. Everybody had a responsibility to find out what is needed and how to fulfill those needs, right?
Well, I mean, that depends on at what age, because there is, through most of humanity's history, people produce their own food, so there wasn't that really necessity to actually work together all the time. A lot of people were able to be very much their own world. You do have to get along, but it doesn't take that much cooperation all the time.
No, yes, but this is what I'm saying. Is now we're in the future where, you can't do that. Things have changed. So distributed information processing was a lot better. But going into the future, it seems like that's reversing. It's actually becoming what the communists wanted is actually becoming true. The processing power that we own today and in the future will allow for centralized decision making, right? If one global computer, if one algorithm can make all the calculations, like the stock market is a perfect example. to pick stocks and buy them and sell them. Well, there are algorithms doing that. Then they're taking millions upon millions of stocks and deciding about those stocks on a second to second basis, right? So centralized information processing is possible. We have that processing power now, right? So how do we implement that information processing model, right, with the technology that going into the future? How do we implement that? So number 3 is select a proper deity made for your system thus far. So again, monotheism seems to have caused more problems going into the future than it solved in the past. Therefore, polytheism seems to be the necessary religion to go with, the necessary cohesive software to go with, right? It's kind of strange because the math of it seems to work out this way. If you have distributed information processing in the economic side, then it seems like on the software side or the religion side, you need a monotheism when it comes to the amount of population that we have, right? So you need a centralized story if you're going to have distributed information processing. But then the opposite is true. If you have a centralized information processing system for the economy, then you need a polytheistic sort of like religious software to run on that system. All right. So I would aim to suggest that we need polytheism in some manner, right, going into the future. Then we have to reevaluate and interpret all the descriptive definitions. So when I say God, when I say faith, when I say these, we have to define what those things mean according to the new polytheism that we would be creating into the future. Mm-hmm. And then strengthen sacrificial ritual. So that's definitely important, because you can see how it's one thing for people to believe in one story, but how do you really enforce that belief? Because if the priest tells me you can't have sex, you can't masturbate, you need to come to church every day, you need to eat fish on this day and do this on that day, and so on and so forth. Well, how much ability do you really have to fulfill those beliefs, right? In order to ensure that kind of ability, what you do is you sacrifice. So if the priest tells you you need to give this amount to the church, and you need to flagellate yourself, for example, physically when you've sinned, all these things, well, those sacrifices are going to really motivate you to believe in the system that you've decided to believe in, right? You're going to be like, well, fuck, I'm suffering a lot here. This shit has to be true. Why else would I suffer then? So there's this kind of cognitive dissonance that kind of takes on from that point of view. So we need to implement and strengthen some kind of sacrificial ritual in the religion going into the future. And then we need to implement a trapdoor for it. So we need to give people some way to get out of the suffering, sort of kind of like blow off some steam. Because, you look at the most religious people on the planet, the most fundamental religious people, and they do the worst shit, right? They're like, well, you're not allowed to masturbate even because it's a sin, and yet these people are going to fuck little boys, right? Kind of strange. So you need some kind of trapdoor that allows people to rationalize their suffering and kind of, I guess, monitor that suffering, not mitigate it, so that it's not always, they can rationalize their way out of it to some degree. That seems to be the way things work. And then the number 6 is repeat the same thing, which means that people need several religions. They need 2 or 3 softwares, because again, this is all Yuval's work. If you, I'm almost done here. If you, for example, are Christian, so that's how you deal with morality and purpose. Well, that morality and that purpose that you subscribe to actually conflicts with the religion that you subscribe to when it comes to the economics and the actual practical side of life. So if I believe in capitalism, then I'm not really believing that directly conflicts with my Christianity, because Jesus said, it's harder for a rich man to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go to heaven, right? I guess I fucked that up. But the point is...
I've heard a few different understandings of that specific quote. I think it's more that if you're rich, then you're more addicted to...
Exactly. So you see what I'm saying?
To physical reality, meaning it's harder for you to detach when you move on.
Yeah,
Right.
so you just proved my point. People are going to
Exactly.
interpret those in different ways to
Yep.
justify their capitalism, for example. So this is why you see like conservative Republicans in the States who are ultra Christian. And it's like, well, that doesn't make sense because by the laws of capitalism and republicanism, well, actually, there's three kind of cognitive dissonances that happens when it comes to the far right in the States. Because one, they're conservative, two, they're Christian, and three, they are capitalist. So those things directly conflict with each other. That doesn't make sense. You can't hold one and the other two at the same time, logically speaking. But they managed to do it with the cognitive dissonance, right? So
Hmm.
here's what I mean, or this is again all Yuval's work, but here's what I mean when these three aren't compatible. Well, for example, if I'm Christian and I believe it's better to follow some kind of charitable lifestyle and not try to accumulate wealth, then I shouldn't be a capitalist. If I'm a capitalist, I shouldn't be a conservative. I shouldn't be conservative because to be a capitalist is to disregard the environment in order to make my money, to make profit. Whatever's profitable is what rules. But yet I'm conservative, which means I should conserve my environment and do what I can to conserve it. So it doesn't make sense that Republicans are Christian and conservative and capitalistic at all.
You can see capitalism in a completely different sense, simply that it's free market principles, meaning competition allows for people to have different options and then they make their own
Yeah,
choices.
but
And so
restrict
that's
those options
trusting.
though.
Yeah.
Restrict those options. You have to restrict those.
Shuby. No, not now. Sorry.
But do you see what I'm saying? Like, if you look at capitalism that way, it's still problematic because, like you said, you give people options, but how many options do you give them? Because if you do not give them the options to dump, radioactive waste into the river, then you're going against the capitalistic religion, which is that you should have complete free option because that's how you gain more money. That's how you profit the economy and everybody else. So you can see how all these things conflict. Therefore, we need to create a religion.
I'm just saying that capitalism isn't driven by from what I understand from economics, capitalism doesn't mean do whatever makes the most profit. It means serve the people as best you can and have a free market, meaning that there's no government or very little government coming in and telling you what businesses can.
And when the capitalist religion said free market, people interpreted it the way they wanted to let them do what they wanted to, and that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay.
So
okay. Yeah.
It's a problem of interpretation. People interpret things in the ways that allows them to fit completely conflicting ideologies together.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't going to stop going into the future. Here's the way I see it. I see we need to create a religion in the augmented reality, which is base reality but augmented. So the way we are now, you human beings walking around, meat bags, right? We need to create one on that level, and then we need to create one for the virtual reality. So here's the notes that I have. And after this, I'm really done. We can really start going into the details on all this stuff. For the 21st century, a well-defined polytheism founded on text and evidence should be installed in the augmented reality, and creativity should be the economic, religion, and it could be developed for the virtual reality. So both of these religions could be pinned together with some kind of sport whose team would satisfy a deep urge for competition. So what I mean by that is if we have a religion story, cohesive software, if you will, for augmented reality, then we would need one for the virtual reality that we're about to enter, because we're going to be living in both, right? At least for the foreseeable future, we're going to be living in both, because we already have been, right? Me speaking to you through this computer is a virtual reality. I'm living virtually. But me speaking to you in person is base reality. So people are already, and you're seeing this with Generation Z, or X, Gen X, sorry. You're seeing how they are living in that virtual world to the degree that they've mapped a reality that is conflicting with augmented reality, with base reality, right? You see how, I have the power to be whatever I want. I could be half dragon, half mage in this virtual world. And so I want to apply that to base reality. If I want to change my gender, if I want to, all this stuff, I should be able to do it in base reality. And so that's why you're seeing such a big push for cosmetic surgery and all this kind of stuff. Because it's not just the transgender thing. I mean, you're seeing a lot of people turn themselves into Barbies, like literally looking like Barbie or dragons or demons, whatever they want to, right?
It's also about the morality of base reality,
of
right?
course, we got to think about all that. But the point is, we need a religion to support both realities, okay? And so the realities will be inversed in the future. This deferred one will become, hold on, base reality. Okay, so you see how we've created a virtual reality. We've technically been living in two realities for the entire existence of humanity, right? The virtual reality just wasn't as tangible. The virtual reality was heaven. So you defer everything to the future. You say, okay, in the next reality, which is the eternal, right? This stuff will happen and so on and so forth. So here's what I got to do in this base reality while I'm alive as a human being in order to get there, okay? Well, now we have both at the same time, okay? Which means that purpose becomes eternal life. So the eternal, if you will, is in base reality. So we're going to, the purpose of base reality will be to live eternally. So we're going to try to, our corporeal bodies, we're going to try to make them be sustained forever. That will be the purpose. Before it used to be, well, I want to live forever in paradise with God, in heaven, and I will, because I have a soul. But in the future, it will be, I want my corporeal body to live on forever so that I can live in the real reality, which is the virtual one. See, they'll switch. Base reality will become the virtual one that we see as virtual right now. But already you're starting to see, many people don't see it as virtual. Have you ever talked to a fucking kid? I mean, they look at you and they'll talk about random shit or they'll listen to you, but there seems to be this disconnect. There isn't much humanity to them because the dream that they're having, the dream world, is in base reality. They're looking at you and it's almost like a dream because they're spending more time playing video games, right? Mm-hmm. So those two will be switched. And so a samsara is technically constructed. So that's the end of my notes. Meaning that, so for those who don't know what samsara is, it's this eternal cycle of lives, right? You live, you're born, you live, you die, you're reborn as something else, you live, you die, and so on forever. And the Buddhists try to break samsara by living a specific way, which means that you don't have to live in this internal loop forever. So this eternal loop will be you living different lives in the virtual realities that we're about to inhabit. Okay, you're going to live and you're going to die as a wizard for a while, then you're going to live. You're going to reshape yourself to be a goblin or whatever you want to create. Maybe a Japanese woman, and you're going to live and die as that Japanese woman. You know, and you're just going to continue living on forever, in that sense, in the virtual reality. And the eternal, right, has to be base reality at that point. So this is why you're seeing all these things come together. We just have to look at it for what it is. People are trying to live forever when it comes to their physical bodies, and then they at the same time want to upload their consciousness to a virtual reality that allows them to do whatever. So you can see how the combination of base reality and virtual are coming together in order to give you the cake and allows you to eat it at the same time. So you can have your cake and eat it too. This is the thing that we're working towards. Does any of that make any sense, or is there anything that I missed?
No, it makes sense. I think we can work on our summary of it.
Yeah. So basically, what I'm proposing is that there will be religions, and it'll be polytheistic, but there's got to be a way to be cohesive. We need to create religions that allow for cohesion between religions. So here's what I mean by religion. If I ground it in an example, Joe Rogan has the most followers as a podcaster, for example, right? Well, in the virtual world, whoever likes the world that Joe Rogan created, okay, he builds the rules, he builds the levels, the games, however you want to look at it, but he creates the morality and everything. So you in your virtual world can travel to Rogan land and live in that reality. And Rogan is that God, the God of that land. He can even decide whether it's possible for you to commit apostasy, which means to leave his land, to leave his religion, and just terminate you. Boom. You somehow no longer have access to that virtual world, or maybe you die. Maybe you really truly have no more access to any virtual reality. Who knows if that'll be a possibility in the future. But that's what I mean by religions. And so the problem, though, is that is not the religions and the morality and how they should be created in the virtual world. It's a religion that allows any individual human being to be, well, first off, stable between base reality and virtual reality. It's a religion that has to cross both planes, right? That's what we need to create, because that's how people will be able to transition into that virtual realm. In the future, if everybody truly does manage to live purely in the virtual world, they're like brains in a vat, and that's it, and they live that way, at least we will have gotten to we will have been able to do that without self-destroying, or without self-destruction. Because of
that
this.
Sounds like self-destruction to me.
Yeah, of course it does, and that's why we're going to need a religion, right, that allows for people to encompass the worldview that you see. See, that's what I'm saying. I'm not trying to look at it as what's self-destruction or what's not on a definitive level. If you say that's how you destroy humans, well, that's your definition. Other people say that's how you preserve humans, because we have no choice. But I'm not trying to look at it as which one should be or should not be. I'm trying to look at a religion which will allow for enough stability that whichever one will happen successfully. Because if we don't, then we're just going to self-destroy, existentially speaking, which really applies to both sides of the issue. Whether you can be a brain in a vat living in the virtual world forever, or you can live as a hunter-gatherer from 12, 15,000 years ago on planet Earth like a real human being, both of those are at existential risk. And we need a story that is cohesive enough to allow us to transition, or at least live with both worldviews.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that's it. That's really what I was talking about. And I feel as if though people are going to need a model. They're going to need to understand how to create religions, how to create their own religion. Because in the future, people will have a choice or not. The point is, if you know yourself enough, if you're creative and you have critical thinking on your side, and you know yourself spiritually, which means you need to do a lot of meditation, all this kind of stuff, that will give you the power to create content, to create worlds, and to ultimately you're going to create your own religions, your own cohesive stories. Whereas others are going to become the followers, where they're just going to be assimilated in whatever story seems to be available to them, in their nearest proximity, which is what we've seen forever, right? Is online. If you see those people who create content, they create videos, they build games, the coders, that kind of stuff, or they just keep sharing tweets and commenting on videos and liking and all this kind of stuff. But that content that they're liking and sharing and all this kind of stuff, it's not their own. They're subscribing to it and they're sharing it around, right? They're being assimilated into it and eventually becoming the product, becoming the content, because they're adding their own little comments, their likes, their own support. Do you know what I mean? So they're going to be assimilated. These people will in some way be dehumanized and become part of the construct that other people will truly create.
We should all get shares of Facebook based off of how much we post and how many people see our stuff.
Well, this is the way things are working right now, right? I'm just taking it to its logical conclusion. And so far I've stripped everything of morality, because we need to understand how things truly are heading regardless of morality, because at the end of the day you can debate truth and morality, but things always end up working out the way they work out. And the morality and the truths are things that we interpret for ourselves as objective truth, and objective existence plays it out. So, because 12,000 years ago, I could have explained to you the world of today, and you're going to be like, no, it's not going to be that way because I interpret it to be this way, and this is how things are going to work out. And yet they worked out this way anyway. So everybody always tailors their morality and their truths and their understandings and their interpretations to the actual truth and objective reality that presents itself. Like In the past, they would say something like, only God has the power to talk to anybody or everybody at the same time. Well, now we can do that. I can do it. I'm doing it right now. It's online. Everybody has access to it. Everybody can listen to me. I can have millions of people listening to me right now at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So that really blows away anybody's definition of God being the only one to do that. So what are they going to do? They're going to interpret it differently, right? And rationalize and justify what God's power truly is. So, like I said, morality is something we're going to have to build inclusive to the only religions that we built. Your morality is going to be important, but for your world, your religion, your thing. So we got to decide: do we want to create a religion, or do we want to be assimilated by one?
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that depends what our options are. If there's a good one out there, then. But yeah, I get what you're saying. You want to. What could you call it? An omni-religion, or kind of a shapeshifter religion? A cuttlefish of a religion.
Yeah. Well, I think because the issue is that we have to create a religion that allows for cohesion between two planes of reality, that ultimately that religion is going to have to be something very different. I don't think it's going to be like anything else. I think well, maybe not. Maybe we need to transition, and we do. We need to transition with the kinds of religions we've had in the past within the future. So like I said, if we allow people enough margin for them to transition, so it's kind of like saying, well, God isn't the algorithm, because people reject that right away. They're like, I don't want the algorithm to be God, right? So how do you redefine the term algorithm and reconcile it with the term God so that they can transition into it better? Because regardless of them seeing the algorithm as being just something part of God, or something different that exists beside God, the truth is it rules their world as God does in their minds. The way that they've decided it rules them. It already does. So,
well, I mean,
we don't want to point out the objective truth in the future. This is the way religions work. You never make it apparent to people what objective reality really is like. This is what science does, but science doesn't do shit to bring people together. In fact, it seems to separate people, right? It's like, okay, here's the truth of the world. We can split the atom and like blow entire cities to fucking, ash. Well, how does that bring people together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
it
you
doesn't
can argue,
give us a reason to get together. It doesn't.
No, yeah, you could argue that it gives us the ability to create energy so that we can power our cities on the opposite end of the spectrum. But powering cities has nothing to do with bringing people together, right?
Right. How do you do that?
I don't know where to begin. I think I've talked for, I don't know, like 45 minutes straight.
So basically, at this point, the question is, what is this religion? Right?
Yeah. Well, I think we started it technically already without even being aware of it. Paradoxism. The innate, and for anybody who's still listening, I don't know who would after this rant, but you could go to the video. I hate being that guy who's like, well, go watch this video, but we made already a 2-part video called Paradoxism. You can go on our channel right now and like check it out. But it explains a philosophy that is very inclusive. It allows for two conflicting worldviews to coexist. And that's why we call it paradoxism, because paradoxes are technically the impossible being possible, depending on which paradox. There are 3 different kinds, or 4, depending on who you speak to. But it's very clear that, reality in itself is a paradox on some level. I mean, can non-existence and existence coexist? You know what I mean? At the edge of existence, of where space and time stop, if it indeed does stop, what happens? How do you get to non-existence from there? You know what I mean? I don't really believe that both can coexist. I think, and even if they do coexist, it's clear that the infinite, that the infinite is real. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. The infinite is the absolute truth. There is no such thing as a finite metric in existence or non-existence. Well, existence could be finite, but in non-existence is definitely infinite. So whichever one exists or doesn't exist, or if they coexist, it's clear that the infinite exists. It's a very real thing. And so the infinite is, by our constrained ability to understand and map reality, the infinite is paradoxical. It's the impossible being possible. How can there be no beginning and no end of anything?
Exactly.
It's just this one whole thing. So if it's grounded in that, that's what paradoxism is. It seeks to allow people to understand complex moral issues or physics. That basically you can see anything as a paradox and assume it and live despite these two things being possible. So that way you can have militant atheists live beside fundamental Christians, because a paradoxist understands that both are rooted in very real truths and that they can coexist. In fact, they inevitably do. So that
they kind of end up becoming one another, but
yeah.
you don't have to go and like tell people that.
Yeah, exactly. So the religion that you and I have been creating started with that night when we flushed out the tesseract and how it applies to consciousness and the three paradoxes. So if I want to resume that quickly for anybody, the mechanism of paradoxism, I just described what paradoxism is all about, what it's for, but here's how it works. And it's that the fourth dimension is something that is represented geometrically speaking as a tesseract, which is a hypercube. And through this hypercube, there are three infinite loops, three figure eights that actually, if you look at a tesseract from a specific point, you align the corner of the cube with the opposing corner. Well, it allows for there to be enough shape so that three paradoxes can run through it. Anyway, it's just very complicated. You have to go see it visually. It's complicated to explain, but it's actually very simple. But the point is, if you understand the four dimensions, which is space and time, right? So you have 0 dimensions. You have one dimension, which is a surface. 2 dimensions, which is length and width. 3 dimensions, which is like a cube. Well, if you understand what the fourth dimension is about, right, and how it relates to the other 3 dimensions, you can use that geometry to understand consciousness, and you can understand the infinite in some way, shape, or form. So that's how paradoxism works. And I think it might seem very abstract to anybody who's listening to me right now. They'll be like, okay, I'm completely lost in what you just said. But ultimately speaking, what Oliver and I have been doing is we've created a story, if you will, that reconciles consciousness, right, which would be the essential point of view of anybody who cares to follow any kind of religion that bases their beliefs on there being a soul. So we've reconciled that with the very real objective world we inhabit, the reality we inhabit. The two, physics and metaphysics, we seem to be reconciling them through paradoxism. So paradoxism applies a very neat definition of things that are very abstract, like morality and consciousness and love. And we draw a paradox between those things and a very physical, scientific thing. It's rooted in physics. So if you can reconcile the two, that's what paradoxism is all about. And there is no need for fighting or you know what I mean. People can be anywhere on the spectrum of belief, but assume paradoxism. So that's the religion that you and I have been creating, and that we need to flesh out, because it's like, how do you make it practical now, right?
Mm-hmm. All right.
So there it is. That's everything that I've been trying to get off my chest there in the last couple of days.
Very good. Let it all hang out.
Let it all hang out.
Well, I don't really have much more to add to that.
Well, I mean, for anybody listening, I want them to know we've been having discussions like this back and forth. So you've had a lot to add to it. It's just I've resumed it.
It covers so many different topics. If I wanted to touch on one in particular, we would have to pick it out and flesh it out.
Yeah, well, yeah, because right now my essential question is, how do we create this religion? It's like, well, this is a process that we're working towards.
Yeah. That's not something that we have to do right now, right here, right now, but get started, you know.
Yeah, but I felt it was
What's our godhead named?
Shubi.
Goose.
No, Shubi.
Shubi. Okay.
You shouldn't have shoot her away earlier. That's your god, your future god that you just shoot away.
I'm all powerful. I mean, I created her, so.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. People are going to feel like they're their own gods in the virtual world, right? So, how do you deal with a religion that governs gods? Because you won't be all powerful, like the monotheistic view of God, but you will be God, like godly. You'll have so much power. So, what happens when you face the problem that God has always had to face, which is the absurdity of existence? You know, that's where your power stops, buddy. You know, I challenge anybody to live in any virtual world that they can construct for longer than 50 years, if that, before going insane. Because you can have that power. I'm going to go and create this world and live, you know, as this character and whatever, right? I'll even change the laws of physics and how this, you know, construct works, and I'll just go ahead and learn how to live in that world with those new laws of physics. Great, have fun doing all of that. But eventually you're going to hit that wall. What the fuck is the point of all of this? What's the purpose of it? And in order to escape that, you're going to have to do one of two things. One, you pull the plug, commit suicide, which is obviously not an answer for a community that's healthy and that's thriving. Or two, you're going to live vicariously through the beings that you've created in that universe, right? Just kind of like the idea that I've had for a little while now, which is that it's the notion that God may very well have torn himself into pieces in order not to be irrelevant, in order to escape absurdity. Because
I just want to resume something you said is,
yeah,
there's only so many hundreds of years before you get bored of getting jacked off by a robot.
Exactly. So you're going to want to split yourself, almost like split your consciousness, to inhabit many beings that are in their own ways getting jacked off by their robots. And that way you don't feel so absurd anymore, and purpose starts to be very muddled, and it's no longer something that you focus on, because you're actually living vicariously through thousands, maybe even millions of beings that you're going to create. Then they may as well create their own simulations one day to escape their own absurdities, and it goes on forever and ever, right? And this is why simulation theory seems very coherent.
Until the planet's hit by an asteroid, and then no one knows what the fuck happened. Their whole virtual reality just falls apart and they're dead.
Exactly, game over. So, yeah, there's so many topics like simulation theory, religion, like all these things. Reality seems to blur together with, you know, like Yuval says, you know, you're always in a matrix. You know, you're in a matrix right now, and if you were to wake up, you would wake up in some other universe or some other construct, which is a matrix. So ultimately, it doesn't matter if you go into the virtual world that we're about to create, or you stay in base reality, which we think is base, maybe there isn't, right? Ultimately speaking, you have to work towards well-being. You have to be healthy, mentally, spiritually, physically, because you can't escape the matrix. It's a dream within a dream within a dream. It never ends. It doesn't matter where you go or what you do. You can recede into the very depths of your own mind, which is what virtual reality is technically, or you can explore Mars, you know, which is external to your corporeal body, but it doesn't matter until you actually know who you are and you can feel connected to all of these things, and you can somehow inhabit purpose. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
I really don't have much to say tonight.
that's okay, man. I think I had a lot to say, and just the way things turned out. But I mean, you really helped me think about these things yesterday, so I felt like there was some use in podcasting it tonight.
Cool, perfect.
All right. Hopefully, some people like ask questions or debate things or bring things up. I don't know, but feel
That'd
free.
be nice.
Yeah, I'd like to. All right, peoples. Have fun munching on that piece of fucking thought. Try to digest it. Peace.